Erev Tov. Hi, everybody. A few weeks ago, my young daughter, who is in kindergarten at a Hasidic school in Brookline, had a play date with one of her classmates. It was a Sunday morning, and we both headed to this Hasidic family. As we got there, my daughter didn't let me leave, and I found myself having some sort of a play date with her friend's father, a very confident young rabbi. And immediately we found ourselves engaged in an intense conversation about the state of the Jewish people these days, because, what else is there to do? This rabbi, trying to show me just how liberal he is, quoted to me a desperate question that his friend, a conservative rabbi, just asked him. So what will be then, my friend, with the sinking ship? What will be? The answer he gave to his conservative rabbi friend was, the ship is not sinking. The only question is, who is going to stay on it? I, quite appalled by this answer, took a very deep breath and shot back. I began, I was raised in Israel, where the question is a little different. We're less terrorized by the sinking ship perspective on Jewish existence. We totally do worry about it, but in a more literal sense. The question that I was raised to ask is, on what kind of ship do we want to sail? How can we turn the ship into one that is worth raising our children to keep sailing on? End of quote. End of the conversation. I was raised in Israel in the 1970s and 80s, and the notion that modernity, enlightenment, the breakdown of traditional hierarchies and authorities, the rise of autonomy, of subjectivity, of democracy, and not to mention the Holocaust, that all these new waters into which we have sailed are challenges that the old ship cannot ignore. From a young age, we were raised to take responsibility for our surroundings, for our culture, for our future. But the truth is that the new waters that eventually almost sank my ship, my Jewish identity, were precisely the rise of feminism, which exposed so simply and clearly just how patriarchal Judaism is, historically and today, all the way down and up. I encountered feminism years after I was deep in Jewish studies, learning and teaching. As I was using the new feminist lenses, learning the Jewish texts, my heart began to sink deeper and deeper, recognizing the trivial but painful fact that my tradition, my love, my identity was defined by men for men, reflecting male life experience, interests, and needs. And it made me very confused with a strong sense of betrayal and abandonment. For some years, I tried to deal with this challenge through feminist theology and worked on my master's thesis under the direction of Professor Tamar. I dealt mainly with feminist theologians' critique on transcendence, in which they had identified the construction of masculinity as a kind of alienation that sees relationship and dependencies as pathological. It was then that I grasped the link between patriarchal theology and patriarchal norms. The liveliness that feminist theology afforded me diminished for a while, my anger and the sense of helplessness. But as the years went by, my utter identification with feminist theology grew weaker as I came to understand that transcendence is a fundamental human intuition that cannot and should not be dismissed or denied. Unlike many feminist theologians, I didn't feel I could discard the entire tradition and create new ritual from scratch. Even if I toyed with the idea from time to time, because I felt that the holy sources reflect genuine realities, even if I don't like them. And I understood that the sources, on their own terms, were not projecting an ideal, but reflecting realities that summon, demand a response. I tried in my classes to use historical perspectives to justify the unjust attitudes towards women, or as I saw it, towards life, that are expressed in the sources. that this was the best they could do for their time and was maybe even good for their time. But I was stunned again and again by this strategy's limited effect to solve the problem and leave me safe and satisfied on a ship. On the contrary, as long as I used in my classes what increasingly seemed to me like historical apologetics, I felt more and more alienated both from Judaism and from myself. At some point, I just couldn't study Talmud and Tanakh anymore because the bitterness facing my helplessness to see in these words of moral and existential inspiration broke me. I was in great stress. And then a miracle happened. A man-made miracle, or more accurately, a woman-made one. I found a little pamphlet of Midrashim written by Rivka Lubitsch, who sits here with us. An Israeli Talmidah Chachama, Jewish scholar, who has been working for years as a To'enet Rabbanit, an attorney in a rabbinical court, representing agunot, mesoravot get, and other people whose insufferable pain is caused by Jewish law or by its contemporary interpreters. This pamphlet included 15 midrashim written in the traditional language and authoritative literary tools used by the rabbis 2,000 years ago. Rivka's midrashim, relating to different unjust expressions, laws, images regarding women in the Tanakh and in the Talmud, were witty, deep, uplifting, and empowering. They were playing the traditional game by the same tools. They were somehow a part of the tradition of Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral Torah. They were sacred, too. The revelation of Rivka's midrashim, alongside other midrashim written in English by American women that Yehuda, my husband, showed me, had paused that ship of mine from sinking and enabled me to realize that now it's up to me to adjust and to direct the ship to a good and maybe a better place. So I tried using this method myself, and cautiously and a little fearfully, I found myself coping with problematic expressions, humiliating stories, and unbearable statements that bothered me in the tradition sources for a very long time. With a little bundle of women's midrashim in my hand, I set sail on a new journey around Israel, wherever I was welcomed, to teach those midrashim as holy scriptures, kitvei kodesh, trying to convince whoever was ready to listen that this was real, that the other half of Judaism is being written these days, and soon our Jewish bookshelf will have to make a lot of room for all the new midrashim, new halachot, new mysticism, new theology, and will finally come an aliyah to its homeland. Well, I'm afraid nobody was standing at the door to those Batei Midrash, teacher training courses, Jewish studies institutions, shuls, and many reading groups that I attended to welcome us happily to join the game. I met a lot of resistance towards the attempt to resurrect the genre of Midrash, and it was considered as an act of hubris, heresy, or just plain chutzpah. But in one of those nights, at a women's shiur I gave in Modi'in, I met Nechama Weingarten-Mintz, a woman a little younger than myself, who shared with me secretly the reassuring fact that she too had a collection of midrashim written by women, and that she too had realized their redemptive power. It didn't take long for us to take upon ourselves this project of publishing a volume of women's midrashim and of finding a publishing house that would love the idea. We put together a joint agreement with Yediot Achronot, the biggest publishing house in Israel, who supported the idea, though not financially, of course, and the Jewish agency, who did give a little financial support too. I even managed, once Blue Greenberg taught me how to write a grant application, to receive one grant from one American Jewish woman who only vaguely understood what I was talking about, but believed in us enough to waste a little money on us. It was much more difficult to get a hold of the materials that we knew were circulating around. For instance, there was one midrash particularly that I heard in some shul by some woman that was so amazing, and I went to her house several times and she never gave it to me. She was afraid that her husband will know that she wrote it herself. But she wasn't the only one that refused to cooperate formally with. It was difficult to define professional editing standards, to find the time to work on it. Both of us were working in different jobs, of course, giving birth and raising little children. But we did it. We sent out a few emails and circulated by word of mouth that we were looking for Midrashim and began to receive one after the other. Some by well-known teachers, activists, and educators, most of them from women we'd never heard of before. And it turned out that they were been writing Midrashim for years and leaving them in the drawer. It took us several years to edit, eventually 90 Midrashim written by 37 Israeli women, and release this new volume to the world, praying that it would find its way to the Jewish bookshelves alongside the traditional Midrashim, its male comrades, to be learned and taught in Batei Midrash, yeshivot, schools, academic institutions, and mainly in private homes, where people prepare drashot and divrei Torah to their milestone events, or just study Torah Lishma. We called it Dirshuni, seek for me, or search me out, or interpret me, as God requests Israel to do for him in Amos 5:4, Kecho amar Hashem levet Israel, dirshuni v'chyu. Thus said the Lord to the house of Israel, seek me, search me out, and live. So what was this dirshuni? That was paving its path to the Israeli bookstores and was confiscated by two book chains right with its birth in the summer of 2009. It was a collection of midrashim, by which I mean that the texts take as their point of departure other earlier canonical texts and engage both the ideas and the language of the earlier sources in a deliberately dialogical way, as do the ancient texts of the oral Torah. Most of the Midrashim in Dirshuni were dealing with issues of special concern to women, but there were many others of more universal interest, and all represent the existential struggle of Israeli women. A great deal of them were dedicated to the treatment of women by Jewish law and rabbinical authority in the traditional sources, in the community, and in the rabbinical courts. They offered deep and wide-ranging discussions of biblical personalities, women's religious roles, sexuality and fertility, prayers, the meaning of Torah study, different issues of social justice, theology, and more. A diverse range of Israeli women contributed their perspectives to the book: Orthodox women, conservative, Reform, and avowedly secular, of all political stripes and ethnic backgrounds, from cities, kibbutzim, small towns, and suburbs. Just binding all these writers together in the same book was a scandal by itself, but that's for another time. I mean, it was a scandal. Maybe this is the place to note that our male tradition is, notwithstanding its patriarchal nature, so diverse, exemplifying the diversity of the human condition and the diversity of ways to understand and assess this condition. So the Midrashim in Dirshuni continue to reflect the same culture of disagreement, of an alert, vigorous, and subversive look at our world. It seems like Jewish women are not any different from their male counterparts, in this sense that they too have much to say about everything, and they definitely do not all think the same way. So if our tradition is a collection of different perspectives and evaluations of reality, is there really anything unique in women's midrashim? Were there really new perspectives that never appeared in Judaism before and justified all the bother? The answer is that at the beginning, I wasn't sure. Nechama and I kept searching in the Mekorot with every new midrash that we received, whether the idea had already appeared somewhere before. We kept asking ourselves, couldn't a man write that midrash too? After spending a long time with this text, I can tell you that, at least from my perspective, most of the midrashim in Dirshuni offer purely original ideas, and at least some of them could have been written only by women. Midrashim discussing sisterhood, motherhood, miscarriages, the power relations in the rabbinical court with all their subtle nuances. These themes and others finally were heard loud and clear, at times written by the blood of those darshaniot, those midrashists, given to us in tears and gratitude, which made the work on the book a sacred work for us. I'll just give you an example from just a few weeks ago. In the new volume that I was working this semester, there are a few midrashim on incest. And of course, the Darshani took all the examples from Jewish texts that you didn't know that that's what really happened there. But she points out gently how the verb or the term appears also in other places, that you can really understand that it has been incest there. So I didn't want to ask, what's the story, but every person that sent something, of course, it sits on their thing. And then we found that the writer is the attorney that presents the city of Jerusalem in court, and she's in charge of all sex crime in children in Jerusalem and the area. And after I received those midrashim and we went back and forth editing them, she sent me such a thank you note. She sent me, I was so grateful to her that finally she dealt with this emotionally after dozens of years that she's working there. So who knew? I mean, and we got few of these, that kind of yachas. And then, of course, it didn't take long for the House of Israel to respond to the new member in its bookshelf. And the book's publication in July of 2009, book reviews, letters, and emails to us and to others defined it immediately either as the end of the beginning or as the beginning of the end. That letter review was manifested in multiple ways. Perhaps what surprised me the most was people's surprise at women's motivation and desire to write sacred texts. After all, we have now had several decades of women's Torah study in all sorts of settings, from women's midrashot, which are actually yeshivot, to the range of pluralistic B'tei Midrash, in which men and women, religious and secular, study together all over Israel. What did they expect? That all these women will go on being passive students? That the revelation of just how patriarchal the tradition texts are wouldn't shake them? That they wouldn't acquire the serious tools to respond with? Here is one of the responses to the book, which you may find interesting. I would like to read to you a responsum, a shoot, halachic question and answer, that appeared on a website Moreshet, a very popular Tzioni Dati, religious Zionist or modern Orthodox website, which offers, among other religious services, a response service, where you can send a halachic query, a shaila, and receive a free answer by a Tzioni Dati, modern Orthodox rabbi. You won't believe how popular it is. There are dozens of thousands of questions on this specific website, and there are few of them. So this responsum from July 2011 relates to the halachic status of Dirshuni. I'm reading the shaila first. Esteemed Rabbi Shlita, what's the law regarding the book of women's midrashim in terms of gniza? She doesn't know if she should throw it to the garbage or she has to throw it to gniza, because Nebuch, she feels that something is... But she understands that it's problematic to have it on the shelf, of course. The book is modern and written by women of our time in the form of midrash of our sages of blessed memory. She gives the link to the book and her name. I'll keep it. So the answer, throw it to the trash, and the sooner the better. Midrash written by women, some of whom don't observe family purity and kashrut, dressed up as rabbinic midrash, is an indecency and unfit for possession in a home. The midrashim of Chazal, the rabbis, written in the Holy Spirit, and human literary creations have no sanctity, and there is in them at times confusion and heresy, as in some of these midrashim. The confusion leads to bringing the Torah down to a human creation and not divine. טוב. Yeah. זהו. Well, it's true that like the Midrashim written by our rabbis many centuries ago, that were, as we all know, among the most hallowed texts of the Jewish tradition, the texts gathered in Dirshuni are radical, expanding horizon, challenging assumptions, forcing rethinking, and demanding action. These Midrashim in Dirshuni do read the sacred text closely, creatively, even playfully, yet always meaningfully. And the demand that they press onto the reader and onto the larger community are difficult to ignore. Eventually, Dirshuni sold very well and slowly did find its way to the shelves of the traditional Midrashim and is being taught in several educational programs in Israel. Here in America, it has been taught in Machon Hadar, and now this semester I'm even teaching it here in Boston in Hebrew, in a course I was asked to develop for the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College in response to the request of their students. Moving to America last year was, as some of you know, not easy for us. Yehuda, my husband, received an unexpected invitation from Brandeis, and we found ourselves leaving family and friends, moving to the Galut, not clear for how long. The adjustment was, in 2 words, very difficult. But thanks to friends, most of them are here today. And some miracles, we managed to go on, being involved in some of the activism that is so important to us. One of the miracles was receiving a Scholar-in-Resident scholarship from HBI, the Helen Gartner Hammer Scholar-in-Resident grant, that enabled me to work on the next volume of Dirshuni that I hope will be published in Israel next year. You see, after the book's publication, my colleague Nechama and I kept receiving more and more midrashim from the original Darshaniyot of Dirshuni and of new ones who turned to us in the hope that we could publish their midrashim too. And so we took upon ourselves to turn this publication to a series and had collected enough materials to the next volume. This past semester, here in HBI, I edited midrashim dealing with topics ranging from mamzerut to giyur, conversion, to incest, long singlehood, post-Holocaust theology, and much more. I feel that the next volume will be in some ways more ripe and richer than the first one. The use the writers make of the master's tools is much more fluent and daring, and their pressing demand for change sounds clear and authoritative. Compared with the insecurity, mild bewilderment, and near sense of sinfulness that characterized our editorial work in the first volume, the work that I have done here on the second volume was accompanied by a great deal of support, approval, control, concentration, and confidence. This second volume would not have been possible without the support and sense of sisterhood here at HBI. Shula, Sylvia, Debbie, Nancy, Amy, Lisa, and Bethany, and my other scholar-in-resident fellows all gave me the feeling that my work is important and right and blessed. But I especially want to thank Phyllis, sorry, who supported this grant financially, but more meaningfully, morally. Years ago, I met Phyllis and Michael through my husband Yehuda, and we spent Shabbat with them not long after we got married. That Shabbat, I was a scholar-in-resident in their shul in Newton, reading women's midrashim from the pulpit, and as opposed to my usual experience those days, I received no resentment or reservation, but only support and respectful listening. Phyllis is enabling me to work on the second volume of Dirshuni here, has strengthened me to believe that it's not in my head only, and this project is real and sustainable, bar kayama. I have until now been talking about Dirshuni. Now I would like to share with you one midrash of mine, which appears in the first volume. I was thinking that if you, Phyllis, decided to name those grants after your mother-in-law, Helen Gartner Hammer, it may be proper to choose a midrash that tries to remember and honor a woman who unfortunately didn't receive them enough in our tradition. This is a midrash that I wrote a few years ago when I was asked to give a talk on Parashat Chukat and was planning to relate to the death of Aaron, described so beautifully and thoughtfully in the parasha. My original plan was to compare between the two descriptions of death the Torah pictures of our two important brothers leaders, Moshe and Aaron. The tongue-tied Moshe, who becomes the master of persuading, who runs the longest dialogues in the Bible and manages to manipulate even God with his exclusive oral expertise. And Aaron, who was supposed to be a mouthpiece for his brother when they stand before Paro, and loses his tongue when his sons die. As is written, Vaidom Aaron, and Aaron was silent. The Torah picture these two brothers' deaths so differently from each other. Moshe dies while still at his peak. Lo chata eino velo nas lecho. His eyes were undimmed and his vigor unabated. Alone on the mountain, facing the land he will never step into, buried by God, the Torah takes leave of its tragic hero. Aaron, on the contrary, dies on a different mountain, surrounded by his beloved ones, passing his garments to his son that will continue his heritage into the future. The rabbis had noticed the differences, and so to speak, went to town in their Midrashim with their descriptions of the brothers' deaths. For them, Moshe represents the fighter that won't give up against all chances. In very long, heartbreaking dialogues with God, they picture the last temptations of Moshe to stay alive against God's will. He fails and dies alone. Aaron, compared with him, is depicted as the model of acceptance. He accepts his death peacefully, separates in a meaningful, beautiful way from his loved ones, and the public mourning for him is painful. But in looking again at the parasha, I noticed, to my surprise, another death that takes place there, Miriam's death. Only it is mentioned so briefly, 5 words only, that I didn't notice it before. Vatamot sham Miriam, vatikaver sham. Miriam died there and was buried there. This is how the Torah takes leave of Miriam, the feminine side of the royal family. I ran quickly to check what the rabbis did with this, how they buried Miriam. What kind of death did they think she represents? But to my surprise and disappointment, there weren't any Midrashim describing Miriam's death. I found only 2 Midrashim relating to it. One that became very popular thanks to the American Jewish feminists of the 70s, the Midrash that ties between the death of Miriam and the story that follows it, Mei Meriva, the biblical story how the children of Israel, suffering from lack of water in the desert, quarrel with Moshe, and of God's command to Moshe to talk to the rock that will spring water for them. The rabbis offered that the lack of waters happened just now precisely because of the loss of Miriam. It was thanks to her that the children of Israel were fortunate to have a special well that rolled with them in their journeys in the desert. When Miriam was gone, their privilege of this well was gone too, and this is the reason they quarreled with Moshe. A second midrash I found appeared in Midrash Shir Hashirim on the Song of Songs. There, on one of the verses describing the kisses between the lovers, there is a midrash that begins beautifully, explaining how the 3 siblings, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam, all died a kiss of death, with the last kiss by God. I couldn't believe my eyes. Finally, Miriam received the honor, the recognition, the status that she deserves. But the happiness didn't last for long. When the Midrash proves that Miriam too died mitat neshika by God, it points to the fact that the Bible uses a different expression than the one that is used to describe their brother's kiss of death, al pi Hashem. It's not written al pi Hashem in Miriam's case. And the difference explains the traditional Midrash. The reason why it's not mentioned explicitly in the verse describing Miriam's death, that God kissed her with its own mouth, is Ela shegnai lefarsho. It's indecent to spell it out. So it was an amazing Midrash, and the last three words, how shall I put it, diminish. Miriam is not in the same status because God can't relate a woman the way he relates men. Now, it's not clear is what God is, if it's not sneistic to kiss the woman and it is sneistic to kiss mouth-to-mouth men, but that's a different story. So I understood that if there is no description of Miriam's death in our tradition, if she wasn't fortunate to receive the honor and love that she deserves, and her death wasn't ever considered as one from which we can learn something, that's about time to write such a midrash myself. And as we heard before, the sooner the better. So I contemplated for a while Miriam's image as it rises from the Torah. Her care for Moshe the baby, her singing with gratitude after Yetziat Mitzrayim, her courage to criticize Moshe both on his marriage and his special authoritative status. And do you remember that story that she and her brother were criticizing Moshe and only she was punished? And I was contemplating Miriam's image in the traditional Midrashim, her belief in God while still in Egypt, her taking with her from Egypt the drums to thank God properly when it's time to sing Hallel, the hymn of gratitude and praise at the sea. Her care for her sister-in-law Tzipora, who was left alone as a result of Moshe's belief that he should be dedicating his intimacy to God alone. And finally, I thought about another midrash that the rabbis offered in the Talmud Bavli, Masechet Chulin, about the moon, the Levana, that in the beginning of the creation was as big as the Chama, as the sun. The moon, the rabbis said, dared to challenge God with a heretical question, how can two, meaning she and the sun, rule simultaneously together? The polytheistic option was, it seems, challenging one of the rabbis that day in Beit HaMidrash. God's response to the Levana, to the moon, was, if so, lechi ma'ati et atzmech, go and diminish yourself. This is one of the Midrashim that explains natural phenomena. In this case, why the moon, the symbol of femininity, is smaller and marginal compared with the sun. This last Midrash, that has nothing to do with Miriam, but has to do with power relations, and had reminded me the moment that Miriam and Aaron dared to challenge Moshe over his extra special authority he has and his closeness to God, and Miriam alone was punished with leprosy, an incurable illness cured only by Moshe's special prayer. So here is the midrash that I wrote that describes Miriam's death, its meaning to her and to Israel, explaining the kiss of death and hopefully teaching us something about separation from life, about sisterhood, and about love. So I'll read it in English and then I'll read it in Hebrew. And you can see in your page there is the quote of the midrash that says, at the beginning that they were all in the same level, and then ends not so good. But it's the midrash is relating to the pasuk in Shir HaShirim, few psukim of neshikot, and it's yishakeni min shikot pihu, that the lover will kiss me in his mouth. So it's important to the end of the midrash. From the day that Miriam returned to the encampment, God's statement about her, would she not be disgraced, was fulfilled, and she hid in the tent and no longer revealed herself to the children of Israel. Like the moon, which too sought to reign as an equal and was told, go and diminish yourself, she would emerge only at the time that when darkness would descend, and hurried to the well which the Holy Blessed One had left them, which tumbled along with them on their journeys. Miriam sat alone, as the people were scared of her leprosy, lest it return, and she herself waited for that leprosy to come and destroy her face and take her soul. And what would she do every night at the time that she would come to the well? She would lean down to those very same waters to see if the delicate splendor of her face had dimmed. She wanted to know if the skin pendant on it had been devoured, and her eyes sunk again in their graves. When at that time she would see the light still flowed from her countenance, that she had asked for forgiveness and been forgiven, she wept for her face, which nobody any longer ever saw or kissed, not her beloved, not her brothers, not her friends. One night, at the time she usually went to the well to check her reflection, the moon that hung above her appeared to her in the water. Her tears dripped into the well, and the reflections of her face and of the moon mixed one with the other. As she cried, the waters began to recede. She wanted to know what they were up to, and she doubled over the mouth of the well, and her heart sank, as her image was no longer visible in the water. She strained her eyes into the waters, and the moon rose in them again in all her fullness. The moon trembled in the waters, and her visage hid and revealed itself and seemed like that of her mother, Yocheved. Miriam's heart rose up as the longing imprisoned in her from the day that her mother had died broke the lock of her heart and flooded her. She wanted to look at her more, sank her head into the well until she felt a mouth kissing her on her lips. Her empty pitcher slipped to the ground and shuddered. At first light, the one called the morning star, the daughters of Israel came to fill their pitchers at the same well and found it dry. They said, "Let's call our sister Miriam to raise the waters, since this well has been given to us in our wanderings only because of her." They said, "Who will go into the tent?" Since they were scared to. Tzipporah said, Tzipporah was Moshe's wife, "I will, since after all this disease infected her because she tried to bring my husband back to me." She found her lying in her bed, draped in a gentle light, her eyes closed and her lips pursed like a baby's. She said, "We will return to you, my sister." She existed and told them. Some say that as they were preparing her body to burial, they wailed over her, "Who is she that shines through like the dawn, beautiful as the moon?" And some say they wailed, "Oh, let him kiss me with the kisses of your mouth." So I'll read it once again in Hebrew just because it's more real in Hebrew. מאותו היום ששבה מרים למחנה, התקיים בה מה שאמר הקדוש ברוך הוא, הלא תיכלם, והייתה נחבאת בתוך האוהל, ולא מתגלית עוד לבני ישראל. כאותה הלבנה שביקשה אף היא למלוך בשווה, ונאמר לה, לכי ומעטי את עצמך. הייתה יוצאת רק בשעה שיורדת החשיכה, וממהרת אל אותה הבאר שהניח להם הקדוש ברוך הוא, שהייתה מתגלגלת עמם במסעותיהם. ישבה מרים בדד, שפחד העם מצרעת שבה, שמא תשוב, ואף היא ממתנת הייתה לאותה הצרעת, שתבוא ותשחית פניה ותיטול נשמתה. ומה הייתה עושה בכל לילה, בשעה שהייתה באה לאותה באר? הייתה גוחנת על אותה מים, לראות בהם אם הואם זיו פניה. ביקשה לידע שם האור שתלוי בהן נעקל, ועיניה שבות ושוקעות להן בקבריהן. באותה שעה שהייתה רואה שפניה זיו נהרה נסוך עליהן, שביקשה מחילה ומחולה, הייתה בוכה עליהן שלא רואים אותן בני אדם ולא נושקים להן עוד, לא אהובה, לא אחיה ולא חברותיה. לילה אחד, בשעה שהלכה כדרכה לבאר וביקשה לבדוק אספקלריה שלה, נתגלו לה באותם המים מעל פניה פני לבנה במילואה. היו דמעותיה נושרות לתוך הבאר, ובבואות של פניה ופני הלבנה מתערבבות זו בזו. עוד היא בוכה, החלו המים שוקעים. ביקשה מרים לראות מה היה להן. כפפה עצמה על פי הבאר ונפל ליבה בקרבה, שלא נראו במים מקונין שלה. אמצה עיניה לתוך המים, ומתוך כך עלתה בהם שוב לבנה במילואה. הייתה הלבנה מרצדת במים, והיו פניה מסתתרים ומתגלים ונדמים כפני יוכבד אימה. גאה ליבה של מרים, שגעגועים שהיו כלואים בה מיום שמתה אימה, שברו מפתח של לב והציפוהו. ביקשה להביט בה עוד, השקיעה ראשה בבאר עד שהרגישה פה נושק לה על פיה. נשמט כדה הרק לאדמה ונשבר. עם אור ראשון, אותו שקראוהו איילת השחר, באו בנות ישראל למלא כדיהן מאותה הבאר, ומצאוה שהיא יבשה. אמרו, נקרא למרים אחותנו שתעלה את המים, שלא ניתנה לנו באר בנדודנו, אלא בעבורה. אמרו, מי תיכנס לאותו האוהל, שיראות היו מלבוא בו? אמרה ציפורה, אני אכנס, שמחמת שביקשה להשיב את אישי אליי, נזרקה בה אותה המחלה. מצאתה שהיא שכובה במיטתה, מעוטפת באור רך, עיניה עצומות ופיה שמות כתינוקת. אמרה, הדרן עלך אחותי. יצאה ואמרה להן, יש אומרים, בשעה שהיו מכינות גופתה לקבורה, היו סופדות לה, מי זאת הנשקפה כמו שחר, יפה חלבנה? ויש אומרים שהיו סופדות, ישקני מנשיקות פיו. Thank you.